Fierce fighting erupting on the streets of the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk as those supporting and defying the government in Kiev vent their anger at each other. At the end of the day, at least a dozen people injured. And Washington comes up with further sanctions against Russia over Ukraine, blacklisting more individuals and 17 companies. But Brussels resorts to more modest measures and is reluctant to punish banks or firms. Plus, dozens are killed in a series of blasts in Iraq as the country prepares for its first parliamentary vote since U.S. troops withdrew now 3 years ago. Around the world, around the clock. It's RT International with me, Rory Souchet. From the entire news team, thank you for joining us. Rival rallies descended into street battles in the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk. It's still one of the main focal points of the anti-government unrest in the region. At least 14 people injured as police failed to contain clashes between those seeking greater autonomy for the region and those against it. Well, witnessing it all for us, RT's correspondent, Paula Slier.
Anti-Kiev demonstrators were marching down one of the main streets in the southeastern Ukrainian town of Donetsk. We're making our way towards the local administration building where there have been anti-Kiev protesters for several days now. They've been holding that building, saying that they are calling for a referendum and that they're in charge for the moment. The crowd behind me is shouting, "Russia, Russia." They're very angry. Their faces are covered. As you can see, some of them are armed. They're banging these shields. It seems as if the scene is being set for confrontation. And that confrontation came when they met about 2,000 pro-unity protesters, among them members of radical movements. Violent scenes played out as police tried to break the clashes up. A number of people are injured. The crowd has ended here in front of the local administration building. As you can see, some people have set up a barrier here. This is to try and prevent other people from coming closer. At the same time, more and more people continue to arrive. They're constantly banging on these shields. I've seen some of the young men actually holding Molotov cocktails. Many of them are actually holding batons. Things have temporarily ended. The protesters have handed these shields back to the police. The tensions are still high, and it's only a matter of time before there's another flare-up. Paula Slier, RT, Donetsk.
And Paula remains in Donetsk, reporting on the tense situation there. You can follow her on Twitter for updates and pictures straight from the scene, as anti-government protesters there are now preparing to hold a referendum on the region's autonomy from Kiev.
To be in the know, follow us online.
The U.S. has rolled out new sanctions on Russia, seeking to punish it for the escalating crisis in Ukraine, despite Moscow dismissing claims that it's even involved in the first place. This time, the U.S. targeted 7 Russian individuals and at least 7 companies as well. In fact, most of them are connected to Vladimir Putin's judo partner, billionaire Gennady Timchenko. His holding company, Volga Group, is one of the biggest investment companies in Russia, boasting revenue of over $100 billion. And Transoil, which belongs to Volga Group, that's one of Russia's biggest rail transporters of oil. That's also on the sanctions list. Another target is SGM Group, a major gas pipeline builder and one of Gazprom's main contractors. That's revenue around $10 billion. We spoke to Tony Breton, a former UK ambassador to Russia. He believes the West's sanctions are counterproductive. Here's a quick look at his interview with RT's Oksana Boyka. You can catch it all day on Thursday.
Well, I certainly hope it's not going to become a new diplomatic norm. It's unhelpful. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that's gone into this from Washington has not helped the two sides to find agreement. And I know Russia, obviously, having lived there for quite a long time. Russia is a proud, sensitive country, and I think an approach which concentrated more on quiet discussions with Russia, finding areas of cooperation, might have been more successful.
And following America's new sanctions against Moscow, the EU has added 15 more names to its blacklist. It has, however, shied away from following the U.S. example in targeting Russian companies. But why is Brussels being more careful than Washington? The answer could lie in these figures, and they're big ones. Trade between Russia and the U.S. amounted to $27 billion in 2013. However, that is dwarfed by Europe's ties with Moscow, worth over $400 billion over the same 12 months. Economist Max Fraud-Wolf, he says the EU is dividing. It is divided over sanctioning Moscow and has every reason to be more cautious than Washington.
There's a pretty good diversity of opinion inside Europe and inside the Eurozone. So it's a little bit hard to talk about a single European opinion. That being said, Europe has had a harder time and is more tentative and more recent in an effort to get out of this recession than the United States, meaning the economy is more fragile. Additionally, the dependence, particularly on natural resource exports from Russia, is much higher in Europe than it is in the United States.
And in the meantime, Russia's deputy foreign minister says Moscow will have to react to America's sanctions. You can get more details and opinions and analysis on the escalating diplomatic tensions just by going to RT.com. For now on the program, a series of blasts in Iraq on Monday killed at least 50. The carnage comes as the country prepares to vote in its first general election since the 2011 pullout of U.S. troops. Now, most of the explosions targeted the polling stations, but the biggest was at a political rally in the northeast, and that left 30 people dead. Iraq is going through one of its deadliest waves of sectarian violence. More than 900 civilians have been killed in the country this month alone. That makes it the deadliest April in 6 years. And almost 4,000 people have died since the year began. In fact, last year became the deadliest since 2008, with more than 9,000 people killed. All in all, since the beginning of the invasion and occupation, we're looking at 136,000 civilian deaths. Those have been documented. Well, earlier in the program, I spoke to Lucy Kafanoff. She shared her experience of covering the local elections in Iraq. That was last year.
We found a country that was incredibly divided. For example, even in Baghdad, neighborhoods that used to be mixed were now completely separated by sectarian divisions, by sect.
So, I mean, but any massive changes? I mean, any clear changes, though, between then and now?
A much worse escalation of violence and a much worse situation, because back then the people hadn't had to flee. Now the people have fled. We've seen an increase in attacks. These kinds of attacks are far larger than what we were seeing last year, larger death tolls. And it's not just, you don't just have the Sunni radical groups doing it. There's Shiite militias also. There's accusations on both sides of sort of Maliki's forces using certain militias, also the radical forces. And basically it's devolved into this very murky sectarian mess, and very difficult to see how the elections are going to somehow change that.
You know, we spoke earlier to international affairs commentator Eugene Puryear. Let's have a quick listen to see what he thinks.
What I think we're seeing here is the continued fruits of the U.S. invasion, which destabilized the country, and the failed attempt to rebuild the country under different auspices. Right now in Iraq, what we see is something of a confessional system that was set up by the U.S. occupation. They essentially did everything they could through the invasion to divide the country along ethnic and religious lines. And so there is no real national government, even though Maliki is allegedly the head of government for the entire country. And I don't think certainly the election process has done anything to solve that so far. And we've seen, in fact, the Maliki government has even deepened that in so many ways. And so I think that this election will just continue the same state of affairs that we have seen in the post-occupation phase of Iraq, where the divides are not bridged by the elections, and in fact violence continues as different factions fight it out.
You know, I suppose at the end of the day, it's fairly pessimistic looking at the future of Iraq. I mean, certainly from you there, it's a bit of a gloomy future prospect. What can we expect now from this election, though? Is it a step towards ending the sectarian bloodshed, or is that something that you expect might just continue?
You know, the hope, of course, by the people always is that these kinds of elections would change things, but it's difficult to see how that would happen. The government has been in deadlock over the past few years. No single coalition has been able to actually govern and effect change. And the real fear here is that the Maliki's forces will somehow try to consolidate power, and there will be more of a push towards authoritarian rule, more of the same, essentially. And very difficult to see how anyone can transcend these sectarian divisions that have really exploded in the past years. I mean, you don't see the country going in a better direction right now, and it's difficult to see how political change can really change the military situation.
And still to come in the program here on RT International, reversal of fortunes for former colonial master Portugal. Here on the program, we report on how the cash-strapped country's government is sweeping alleged corruption right under the carpet. Why? To secure investment from a former colony-turned modern-day paymaster. Also in the programme, every 4 seconds a traffic ticket is being issued in the UK thanks to potentially illegal CCTV cameras. Those stories just around the corner.
Today, when I listen to John Kerry or Hillary Clinton, it's like that woman in that film, Goodbye Lenin, who's been in a coma, then suddenly they wake up, and you don't want to tell them that the world has moved on. You know, they're 95% of the world's population that's not American. They've kind of like moved on. They've got over it. They're not as in to America as they once were. And so you have what I call the CNN curtain, which is now the new Iron Curtain, if you will. It's an information curtain. People living behind the CNN curtain, they're gradually and slowly losing their touch with reality. And now the people in America, they covet having real news.
And we asked campaigner and UKIP candidate Julian Deverell what he thinks is behind the industrial use of surveillance cameras. Here's what he had to say.
They use it to raise revenue. There's no doubt about that. And there's also another concerted effort on behalf of local councils, which is to try and discourage motorists from driving into their town centres. I believe they use this constant sort of menace, this social menace of the motorist, in order to try and discourage people from driving their cars. I think central government do realise that this is becoming an increasing problem and an increasing menace to members of the public. So the central government are making the right noises, but as yet we certainly haven't seen any action.
Some other global headlines in brief now. Let's get into the RT World Update. In the UK, a politician from the Liberty GP party has been arrested mid-speech for alleged religious and racial harassment during an election campaign. Paul Weston used a quotation about Islam from a book written by Winston Churchill. Describes the religion as, among other things, militant. Well, a member of the public took offence and called the police. To Haiti, where anti-government protesters are making demands on the president to step down. They set up barricades of tires on the streets and set them alight. The crowds accused the musician-cum-politician Michel Martelly of wasting public funds on luxury vehicles and international trips. And at least 17 people have died after more tornadoes hit central United States. The state of Arkansas suffered the worst damage, several towns utterly obliterated. Authorities say they are struggling to find the missing people, all amid the devastation. And North Korea has reportedly started live-fire military exercises on its disputed maritime border with the South. It's the second time in a month that Pyongyang has carried out the drills. A similar exercise in March resulted in the two sides exchanging hundreds of artillery shells. So, water catching on fire in the kitchen, a constant fear of multiple quakes, health problems and environmental damage. Just a few of the surprises caused by the fracking boom in Texas. Up to now, all this had gone unpunished until that is the first ever multi-million-dollar settlement for one affected family. As RT's Abby Martin explains in Breaking the Set, that'll be throughout the day on RT International.
Last week, a Texas family saw a huge victory over fracking. The Parr family was just awarded $3 million after they were afflicted with illnesses caused by a fracking operation taking place on the outskirts of their ranch. According to Lisa Parr, the family experienced, quote, nosebleeds, vision problems, nausea, rashes, and blood pressure issues. Now, considering how the fracking industry has denied such problems are caused by the practice, this case is a landmark decision and a huge win for fracking opponents. However, it seems clear that the family has already been so severely damaged by the drilling operation that a monetary settlement seems too little too late. And considering that fracking injects over 700 chemicals into the earth, including known carcinogens, there's no way to know how exposure to these wells will affect the Parrs later on in their lives, or, for that matter, anyone else who lives near fracking wells.
And in the UK, the debate on the future of the fracking industry is polarising opinion. Local authorities are scrabbling for support as they look to cash in on the investments the energy industry is likely to provide in return for drilling, despite widespread objections. Those details just a few clicks away for you.